Hello and welcome to Taking Liberties episode 30 for season 2017. My name is Lee. I am in Western Australia. This week we've got the full crew back. I've got Zeev in Melbourne
G'day.
and Vickers in Canberra.
Yo.
So we're going to start off talking about the clean energy target, which has sort of ended. There was essentially a series of subsidies for solar and wind. It has thankfully gone the way of the dodo. Though
I like to call it subsidies for supplicants.
That's a good one. It's got a real ring to it. So, I mean, Vickers, you're a resident energy expert when it comes to this sort of thing. So, why don't you sort of take us through what it is and what happened?
By that, you mean that I am someone who has an electrical engineering degree and had some vague accounting with the electricity sector. Yeah, so how to best explain the clean energy target? I mean, other than garbage. So it's a political solution to something that's not actually an engineering problem or even an electrical grid problem. What's happened is someone in Parliament or someone's in Parliament basically goes around and says, we need to have X amount of clean energy. Now, clean energy is vaguely defined, but basically they're pointing towards solar and wind. Now, they say that everyone who signed up to effectively Commonwealth subsidies, well, yes, they are Commonwealth subsidies, Commonwealth subsidies or Commonwealth reimbursements for energy expenses to the states, has to achieve a certain amount of clean energy as a percentage of their total mix. So to do that, there's a number of policies that can come out, usually in the form of subsidies for green energy, or in the case of New South Wales, where you've officially regulated to oblivion cheap natural gas and coal. That's it in a nutshell.
So it's probably worth pointing out that this is not the only kind of source of this sort of nonsense. There's the renewable energy target, which usually gets a lot of the kind of political discussion, which is a mandate of, I think it was 20% by a certain point.
It was 20 by 2020, so 20% by 2020, which, to be perfectly honest, 20% by 2020 isn't too bad a target. 20% renewable isn't too bad. And I say that, I said that with the very much of a sarcastic tone to that, because you're still like
by the relative standards of bad electricity policy, it's like not as bad as what it could be.
Yeah, that's true. That's kind of what I'm getting at. It's just like 20% is not too bad. I mean, effectively, that 20%. Keep in mind what that means is that 20% of electricity that you're paying for is going to be anywhere between 8 and 20 times more expensive than the rest of the energy you're generating. Than the rest of the fossil and dirty fuels that you're generating from. Now, actually, it might come down since then. That was just the calculation back in 2009. It might be better now. It might be worse. I don't know, because all these subsidies and everything like muck up the actual figures, and you kind of have to sit there.
It's difficult to calculate.
Yeah,
but broadly speaking, power prices have gone up as subsidies and as the targets, whether it be from the RET or the clean energy target, or the mandatory renewable energy target, because it's difficult to separate those two things as well.
Correct. Yeah.
Broadly, as those targets have increased, power prices have gone up in turn.
But
Go on.
Yeah, but the interesting thing is the clean energy target, because it's not specific to renewable energy, right? It points towards renewable energy, but it's not specific to it. So one of the things that's snuck in under the clean energy target, which is an expensive way to do it, but it's still made feasible, is methane burning. So methane burning doesn't put out anywhere near as much of the CO2. And that's been quite popular as an option for gas generation. But moving from that, also as a party trick. But from that, one of the interesting options that would have been available under a clean energy target, which is actually an expensive way to generate electricity, is nuclear power. But it's cheaper than solar and wind, right?
Yeah.
It's just if the country didn't have this weird. I don't know how to best describe it. Aversion? Yeah. Good call, Lee. So a weird aversion to nuclear, it would have been quite viable under the clean energy target.
Well, look, I mean, we need to frame that properly. A lot of people are very afraid of nuclear energy, and they see things like that power plant in Japan after that
Fukushima.
massive. Yes, that's the one, going astray, and naturally they blew.
Hang on. That thing's
But
still
that-
active.
I know.
That plant is still active and generating electricity. It took a hit from a tidal wave and an earthquake, right? And it still didn't have a complete meltdown.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not here to say that the concerns are justified as such. I'm just noting that that's the way it's framed in the media, and that's what people perceive, and that's what is very easy to play on in the media, the popular fear that could happen here or something like it.
Yeah. And that's
so
what it is.
That's
it's
why.
fear.
It's not weird. It's just,
I mean, there's really only a couple of nuclear disasters you can really point to as being sort of widespread catastrophes. Chernobyl being the most obvious one, but that was because the Soviets were doing some like insanely stupid things with a method of generating power that I don't think anybody in the West has ever used. So basically,
and the way they warned people afterwards, they took their time about it. They really did.
And then there's 3 Mile Island, which I mean, obviously wasn't anywhere near as big a sort of source of radiation pollution. But I mean, that's still talking about things like from like 40 years ago.
So these are pretty rare incidents.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that has to be borne in perspective as well. And also, I mean, we don't actually have too much in the way of casualty figures arising from the disaster itself of or rather from the power plant aspect of it, because I don't think there really are any
from Fukushima
deaths that so far can be from Fukushima that can really be directly attributed to the power plant.
There won't be. It's unlikely to be anything significant for years and years and years. What you'll see is potentially a small rise in the cancer rates around the area. But it's even like when they blew up the bombs in over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? There were bursts around those explosions in cancer rates. But the thing is, the way what people don't realize is that our planet there is a lot of environment around the planet, right? And this radiation accounts for fractions of a fraction percentage of what's actually there on the planet, and it dissipates quite quickly, and it's absorbed by things relatively quickly as well, not in a long-lasting way. So there's articles there's a particularly good article, and I think I'll find it and post it later, but there's an article about where did all the radiation from Nagasaki go, because they were like, people were saying that Nagasaki would be completely unlivable, for 50 years, so for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it didn't turn out that way. It didn't turn out that way. It's now livable. There's people living. There's millions and millions of people living there. So I mean, and they don't have breaches in cancer rates or anything like that either. So there are very simple physics explanations as to what happens, but you're right. That's not something that you can discuss in the media.
I mean, the other thing is that's worth pointing out as well. I mean, actually, Greenies kind of help with this argument as well, is that there's actual health risks from burning coal. Like you're putting stuff in the air that causes cancer as well. So all of these things are relative to, when you're sort of trying to understand, well, what's the best policy? You need to sort of understand it. Well, there's nothing that's risk free. There's nothing that has zero cost. There's always some cost involved.
There's always some trade-off to be had, particularly when you're dealing with energy sources and their discharge and their they always have some impact. And one thing that was pointed out recently, not so recently, but which I read recently, was that even when you're dealing with power plants, for example, the health impact of a power plant is something that sometimes power plants aren't necessarily responsible for. You see, I mean, often it's the case that power plants might be immune to lawsuits against those power plants by people who are affected by them. I'm not commenting on Australia in particular, but because I can't comment on the Australian law in this area, I haven't looked at it. But I will say that historically, at least during the Industrial Revolution, it seems as if a lot of factories and the like, and a lot of power plants were actually immune to lawsuits from the general public, whether that still for their emission of coal and the like. Whether that still holds true today, I don't know. I would have to check, but it's worth considering whether that's another thing that people overlook. I don't know.
So you're suggesting, like, you could sue people for their pollution, and to be perfectly honest, I'm open to that idea. Like through torts, it's not a bad way to solve it. But the large part is, it's actually the amount of damage that's being done is actually quite tiny when you actually calculate it. And this is the thing. So the reason why carbon...
I would think so, especially with much of the newer technologies. I mean, I imagine in the 19th century, a coal power plant or something, or coal works, coal furnaces, what have you, they might have a very devastating impact on the health of locals around them in terms of air quality.
Absolutely.
But nowadays, I'm a little skeptical that they really, kind of
push out a lot of emissions. Yeah. It's the same as with the with your cars nowadays. You'll notice the emissions kind of less as well. That's actually not as a result of okay. Part of that is a result of emission standards, but like the bigger reason why is because emissions. Anytime you make anything, right, emissions or pollution or anything that is the byproduct that is left at the end of the process, right? And if you're going to get better compression ratios in the case of cars, so that you're burning the fuel more efficiently, then obviously your emissions go down, right? It'll tend downwards up until the basically what's called the maximum energy sort of that's possible to be taken out of it, which you can actually calculate to an atomic level with respect to nuclear energy, where you can actually calculate what the binding energy that's released from the breakup of atoms actually is. And I'm sorry, I'm going way too much into the actual engineering side of this, but the point is, like, emissions are going to go down as technology gets better because we get better at using fuels. Now, whether that necessarily translates to, there being, like, whether it's possible to sue them over that, I tend to err towards the side of the cost would be so small and negligible. I think most courts would say you're probably not worth debating it.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, it depends exactly on what happens and to whom and so on. I accept that because particularly nowadays, I really doubt that it's going to have that massive impact anyway on people that it once had. And also, it's worth mentioning that a lot of fuel byproducts. I mean, in the context of this discussion about the clean energy target, the fact is that polluters have an incentive to find efficient ways to use fuel byproducts as fuel or for other purposes.
Perfume is the best example of that.
Yeah.
Perfume is for anyone who's not aware, perfume is a petroleum byproduct. And you will find most people will buy it for about $120 to $200 a bottle at an airport.
Right. So instead of being spilt out into the sea, it's being sprayed onto people for fun, I suppose. That's good, I guess.
I don't know. Hopefully. Is that going to make some people think twice now, or?
I don't know.
Well, I suspect
but
the people,
they're
since there's only filthy hippies that don't like fossil fuels to begin with, then they're not going to use it anyway. So, with that terrible sledge on people who don't like fossil fuels, let's turn to something which is
that's a little unfair.
Yeah,
go on.
Actually, I don't know where my segue was going. I was trying to make it witty, then I realised we were going to talk about the Las Vegas shooting, which is pretty awful and not worth having a witty segue into. So, the second topic we're going to talk about tonight is the Las Vegas shooting. It's obviously been all over the media. Actually happened last Monday, but it only sort of just happened. And
it happened literally an hour after we recorded this.
did it?
My goodness. Last week.
Yeah.
I thought it was
Last
in the
week.
morning. All right. Well,
No. It was nighttime there. Yeah, it was nighttime there. So you're right. It happened in the morning. It happened on the Tuesday morning.
yep. No, it was on the night of October 1, 2017. So it was Sunday last.
But
anyway, nevertheless, we're talking about it now. So if for some chance you've missed what's happened in Las Vegas, there was a shooting. Stephen Paddock is a 64-year-old man who decided to stockpile a bunch of weapons in a hotel room and open fire on a crowd, a music crowd. 58 people were killed. He injured 489, and he also killed himself. And there's no known motive, and there's been a lot of discussion about the weapons he used. He used a particular firing stock that enabled close to a fully automatic rate of fire, and he had
which apparently he modified, I should add. But go on.
Yeah, well, I think so. These bump stocks were actually you could just buy them sort of anywhere.
They're about $20. Yeah,
yeah.
They're not regulated or anything.
But
also,
I understand there's actually they were regulated. They were banned by the ATF, but then somebody else got the patent and changed it and then got it through. So, I mean, the guy had like 22 rifles and a handgun inside his hotel room. So he was ready to do some serious hurt. But
what I find hilarious is even as soon as this had come out, America, being the way it is, had already come up with a conspiracy theory about how this guy got through. It's like, how did he carry 22 guns into his hotel room? I was in there going like he just packed them up and had a hotel bellhop take it up. I mean, it's not exactly hard, dude.
Apparently he had 10 suitcases that he took up to the hotel. And apparently the hotel room itself was because he was a known gambler in those circles. So the hotel room apparently was free. It was sort of given to him to use. I mean...
Yeah, I guess I
sorry, I was just going to say, like, somebody did a comparison of the Donald subreddit. So the Donald is a obviously a Trump-friendly subreddit on Reddit. And before his identity was known, it was all, this is why we need a Muslim ban, blah, blah, blah. And then after it became known who he was, it must be a conspiracy. It was all very Alex Jones.
It was an inside job. It's a false flag.
Yeah, false flag.
It's a white flag. False flag, yeah. Yeah, and that's where all of these conspiracies began. And I found it... they've been doing the rounds, and I kind of sit there going like, really? It's not that hard for me to believe that it was a white dude, just shooting up the place. Because there have been so many of them doing it. I mean, there's only really been the one mass shooter that was Muslim in America, and that was the Fort Hood shooter.
Three.
I mean...
There's Orlando and there was San Bernardino.
Well, yeah, I forgot the Orlando one was Muslim too.
Yeah.
And Boston.
But I mean,
No, that was a bombing.
No.
Yeah, but I mean, like
Quite so.
I mean, even so, yeah. Like, it's very... These things happen, and most of the time there's not an explanation. I mean, that's one of the issues, from what I understand, of analysing these events, is that quite often there isn't a coherent set of motives. Like, it's not... Like, compared to, say, Paris...
Actually, no. Hang on. This is the first instance where where someone hasn't really... Here's the thing. I had a discussion with a friend of mine who works as a profiler, and he basically said, until this instance, right, there'd been a running theory that the reason why these shootings were happening in America was because it really started after the Columbine one.
Yeah.
And what they noticed was they were all these desperately lonely people that had like all these thoughts and feelings that everybody else just found desperate and didn't want to really, didn't really want to give them the time of
feel
day
listened
for.
to.
Yeah, they didn't really want to be listened. Sorry, people normally don't want to listen to such a sob story. But once they went on their shooting rampage, right, they were immortalized, right? They were case studies of these people. Like, there were people sitting down and analyzing this shit and like really trying to figure out their brain and stuff. And like my profiler friend was like, imagine if you were a lonely, desperate piece of shit, right, who couldn't get a single person to listen to you, right? And all of a sudden, if you were told you do this one thing where you run around killing everyone and then off yourself, you're going to be immortalized in like, everybody's going to be reading about you forever and ever and ever.
Yeah.
And he said the running theory amongst like profilers was that it's just desperate lonely dudes that don't have anyone who listens to them.
Yep.
right?
And that could well be the explanation here.
Until now, though. But now, right, they're sitting there going like, gambler had a girlfriend, also like seemed to have contact with his family, and they're sitting there going like, well, this guy just breaks the mold. What the fuck's going on here?
Yeah.
But then again, how strong were those links to his family and his girlfriend? A person can be a loner on the inside, so to speak, and still feel not listened to in some sense, and just use it as a way of gaining attention for himself.
Yeah,
possibly true. Maybe
death.
it still holds.
And the other thing is, like, there's lots of sad, desperate loners in the world, and not all, like, the vast majority of them don't go killing a bunch of people. So one of the reasons I brought up the motivation side of things is that when you start thinking about, okay, I mean, that's a great theory, but like it's hard to say, well, we're going to find out it's this particular weirdo, this particular weird loner, that we're going to single them and say, we can predict that person's going to go and shoot up a school, or that person's going to shoot up somewhere. Like, you can't, it's very difficult to sort of predict when that's going to happen, because America's a big place. There's a lot of guns, and it's hard to know.
There's hundreds of millions of people.
Exactly. So,
and risk profiling is not easy.
Yeah.
I mean,
and the number of mass shootings is actually very small. So obviously it's a lot of attention, and all the major shootings, their names. So Orlando and Sandy Hook and Columbine and all these other things, but like there's still only maybe a dozen of these super high profile shootings in 20-something years, so it's
absolutely
like the number of, we're talking about a handful of individuals where it's hard to identify them as compared to every other person who might fit that sort of category, and that's why it's hard to understand.
Just to be clear, I'm not suggesting we go Minority Report on this shit.
Well, no, I agree. So, but I mean,
yeah,
when we talk about
and one thing that should be added to this as well is that the mass shootings data, as you point out, there's very few mass shootings.
Yeah.
Now, it's often said that in the United States there's a lot of shootings every day, but they're not mass shootings in this kind of
mass shootings.
terroristic
it depends how you
sense.
define mass shooting. So this is part of the issues is if you define it as any for casualties, so that is somebody who's wounded or killed, including including the shooter. You have an incredibly large number of people. So, you've got a very, very extensive group.
So,
if you say if it's just a person who kills a bunch of people in a public place for no apparent reason, so not terrorism.
Then it's actually quite small.
Then it's very small.
Then it's actually... Yeah,
that's what I'm getting at. But the data
indicates
that there are other kinds of shootings that are common in the United States. And it's worth pointing out that, for example, there's a lot of gang warfare in the United States, often using handguns. Often those handguns are not possessed legally by the people who are possessing them. And what I'm getting at is that, yes, these are tragedies that we need to understand, but we also need to understand that the causes of gang violence and gang warfare are another important aspect of the American homicide rate being so high.
You're talking about the trouble.
And that in itself is not going to be solved by addressing gun control as such, because the reality is these guns are already illegally possessed by a lot of the gangs in the first place.
And when it comes to legal possession, using them for killing people, it's often, from what I understand, domestic violence. So crazy ex-boyfriend goes, buys a gun, goes and kills that ex-girlfriend and ex-girlfriend's mum and dad and grandmother. So there's and then turns the gun on himself. So that's also a sort of a major cause of, or association with these multiple shootings and multiple casualties.
So,
the broader point to be made is these are all criminal justice issues, I think, and that's one that it seems to be lost in the national understandable fear and reaction that comes about when these mass shootings happen. But what's lost in that is the understanding that criminal justice and crime prevention is incredibly complex and difficult. And it's not a product of this just kind of 1 minute fix that will happen if we retool this policy or that. There are things that will reduce crime. I mean, criminal gangs in the United States mostly exist to trade in illegal drugs. And if we address that issue, then we reduce gun crime and all crime by getting rid of the illegal gun trade, by getting rid of the illegal drug trade by legalizing it,
Sure.
hopefully. But even that is not going to do away with all violence, crime, etc. in the country. And it's not going to do away with this man, whether he, or with people like this man, this Las Vegas shooter, using whether it be a truck or a gun or God knows what other awful weapons such a mass killer can think of, the bombs in Boston, what have you. The fact is that this is what people don't seem to understand, that the conspiratorial people especially don't seem to understand, that our society is incredibly fragile, and it really depends on people choosing not to kill each other all the time. Killing people, unfortunately, is really, really easy. Okay? For anyone who takes the time and effort to do it, it is a stroke of luck, in a sense, for anyone who takes the time and effort to do it as a mass shooter type person, to not kill a lot of people. It is incredibly easy to get into a car like the Burke Street Killer and to run people over.
Yeah.
And no amount of laws and regulations and is going to change that fundamental fact about just this common implicit agreement we all have not to hack each other to death every day is what really is keeping us alive.
Society?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. It's not like the newest gun law is going to save us.
So I want to tackle two things. Firstly, so yes, going on from that, it's not about gun laws, right? But the interesting thing is one of the things that the gun lobby, the people asking for gun laws, tougher gun laws in America, they frequently say we haven't even gone 10 days without a mass shooting. And yes, as you pointed out, the reason why you haven't gone 10 days without a mass shooting is because the definition they use is so broad, right, that it includes any shooting that, occurs with 4 or more people involved, which is a lot of gang-related violence, right? And it's not even with legal guns, usually, most of those cases. But the other side of that is also, I don't think America could ever enact gun laws. Right? A large reason, and this is something, if you're an American listener, you should understand, Australia's gun laws only worked because of 2 reasons. Firstly, there was a buyback in place, which we could afford. You guys cannot fucking afford a buyback. I guarantee you the United States cannot afford a gun buyback. Right? And the second thing was, we had it on board with all of our states agreeing to toughen up their licensing regime. Right? Because the federal government can't do that. So the point is, you had it on board where the states would basically make it harder to get guns, and at the same time, we bought all the guns to take them off the street. That can almost, that is, I'm 100% sure that'll never happen in the US.
Well, you say all the guns, but I think it was about 20% of the guns. So there are still hundreds and hundreds of thousands of firearms in Australia legally, and many more, we might say, illegally. We don't know exactly, but customs can hardly police everything. There are weapons shipments caught in Australia, and if there are weapons shipments caught by customs, then there are those that aren't caught, many more, I would think.
So there's a few aspects. I mean, firstly, they have tried gun buybacks in America and more strict gun control in certain states, and people just stick the guns under their bed. I think they tried to have a firearm registration drive. It might have been New York, it might have been Connecticut, it was somewhere in that kind of northeastern area, and they had a paltry response because, well, people don't want to give up their guns. They want to keep them, and the best way to keep them is to not tell the cops they exist. So, they have tried some of these things, and it doesn't really work. As for Australia, I mean, the
I'd say our
is correlation. It does not imply causation. So people say,
I think the reason it works in Australia,
I think the culture of Australia is actually the biggest testament to why gun violence is down. We collectively just decided, hey, this is a thing we're not going to try and have. Right?
Except in
guns are
literature,
deeply unpopular.
So there was a report that it was like I think it was Melbourne University or something.
No, it was Simon Chapman. It was Simon Chapman's report. I know which one you're talking about.
Where the one that said there was no change.
Yeah.
Yeah, they did it.
Yeah, they said there was no change. Yep, they said there was no change between before and after. So, ironically, that was by Simon Chapman, who is the head of the Australia. Yeah, well, don't want to get
Well,
done for
he's a
defamation.
proponent of gun control, among other things.
Yeah.
things, yeah.
And yet
But
his own report indicates that gun control hasn't had a perceived or a
no.
statistically
He's
significant impact.
statistically
Unclear.
significant was his word. Yeah. No, he said no. His words were clear. He said
No, as it's
unable
unclear
to
there was
establish.
anything.
He said they were unable to establish a statistical link between the activation of the gun laws and a reduction in firearms deaths.
Exactly. So that there wasn't many mass shootings before Port Arthur. They obviously, I mean, there have been a couple, but not obviously to the same extent as after Port Arthur. There's no necessarily any causal link. New Zealand kept their guns. They kept their gun laws, before and after. And Australia and New Zealand are very similar cultures.
Except New Zealand has looser gun laws.
Exactly. Yeah. So
said.
often in a lot of these things, there's lots of correlation and causation, and it's actually pretty straightforward. If you go, okay, who has the highest murder rates? Well, it's not the US. I mean, it's a bit of an outlier amongst industrial nations, but against everybody else, it's not an outlier, and it's also an outlier in a bunch of different ways. Primarily being population.
Hang on, it used to be an outlier, but now, largely thanks to rising, ethnic tensions in like Germany and France, particularly from the Algerian population and Turkish populations respectively, it's no longer as much of an outlier as it used to be.
Sure. Okay. Well,
actually, murder rates in the US have gone down over the past 10, 20 years. It should be mentioned, despite firearms becoming far more available.
Yeah, exactly.
So I guess it's just not as simple as we like it to be, I guess. I mean, if only it were so simple as to just say, get rid of the guns and then, crime will fall and nirvana tomorrow. But it's just not that easy.
There's an episode of Freakonomics, I think it was called Where's All the Crime Gone? And it was basically looking at why everywhere in the OECD crime rates dropped. And basically they surmised it was due to two things. Firstly, a lot of liberalization, things that were illegal are no longer illegal. They were mainly talking about prohibition there. And the other thing they said is everyone's richer.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, crime is a living. This is the thing. It's a matter, if you want to understand criminal justice, crime is, for a lot of people, an occupation, a way of making ends meet, whether it be by stealing or by dealing in drugs. People are making a way up. Do I do this and break the law and take all the associated risks of getting caught and going to jail and all of this, or do I have, embrace a clean life, so to speak? And as people become wealthier, well, I mean, obviously people find it easier to live legal lives as people become wealthier. That's all it comes down to. Yeah.
And on that note, I think we'll wrap things up. So thanks everybody for joining us. You can like, share, and subscribe to us on iTunes and on YouTube. And we'll be back again next week with more discussion.
Yep.